In this video for section 1.5, we're going to see our third method for solving quadratic equations, and this is called completing the square. So when we're working with completing the square, we're going to have a binomial, x squared plus bx, where b is going to be a number. What we're going to do is add b divided by 2 squared, whatever number that is. And that sounds a little bit strange, but the purpose of this is it creates what's called a perfect square trinomial. So when we add this number, what we get is something that is very easily factored. And not only is it easily factored, but the two factors are going to be the same. And so we'll be able to write it as x plus some number squared. And then we can use that to solve the equation. So we're going to start with example 3 from the textbook. And we're only going to do part A here because we're only going to do the easier types of these problems. It's easiest if your b is a number so that when you divide it by 2 you get a whole number, or in other words an even number. If b is an odd number, then you get fractions and it's a little bit more ugly. So we're just looking at part A. So the question says, what terms should be added to each binomial so that it becomes a perfect square trinomial? Write and factor the trinomial. So to calculate what terms should be added, we do b divided by 2 squared. And in this case, my b is 8. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So that means we're going to add 16. So when I do that, what I get is something that is easily factored. So how do I factor x squared plus 8x plus 16? Well, it's going to be 2 sets of parentheses. We don't have a number in front of x squared, so we're just looking for 2 numbers that multiply to 16 and add to 4. And so that's going to be 4 and 4. So not only is it easily factorable, we get 2 factors that are the same. And so I can write this as x plus 4 squared. So next you should look at checkpoint problem number 3. You only have to do part A. Do this in your notes, check your answer, and then move on with the rest of the video. So now we're going to talk about how you actually use completing the square to solve the quadratic equation. These are the steps. First, you want to get the variable terms on one side and the constant term on the other side. So when we talked about factoring, we needed to have 0 on one side of the equation. For completing the square, we want to have just the x squared and the x term on one side of the equation with the number on the other side. So it's a little bit different in that way. Our x squared term should have a coefficient of 1. You can use completing the square if it doesn't have a coefficient of 1, but it's a little bit more complicated. And so we aren't going to see any of those problems in this class. Step 2 is to take half of b and square it. Add this value to both sides of the equation. Keyword is both. And then step 3 is to factor the trinomial into a binomial squared. Then we're going to use the square root property to solve. So we're going to look at example 4 from the textbook. It says to solve by completing the square, x squared minus 6x plus 4 equals 0. And one thing that I want to point out really quickly is that for this one, I can't solve this by factoring, because if I were factoring, I would be looking for 2 numbers that multiply to 4 and add to 6. The only pairs of numbers that multiply to 4 are 4 and 1 and 2 and 2, and neither of those pairs add to 6. So this is why we need other methods for solving quadratic equations, because factoring won't always work. Not everything can be factored. So my first step is to get the x squared and x terms by themselves, so I need to move the 4 over. So subtract 4 from both sides, and that gives me x squared minus 6x equals negative 4. Now I'm going to figure out what I need to add to both sides. Take half of b and square it. So b is negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And negative 3 squared is positive 9. Notice that even if my b value is negative, once I square that, I should get a positive number. So you should always be adding a positive number to both sides when you're doing completing the square. You should never be subtracting. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. That gives me x squared minus 6x plus 9, and negative 4 plus 9 is 5. Now this trinomial should be easily factorable, and it is. What are two numbers that multiply to 9 and add to negative 6? Well, that's going to be negative 3 and negative 3. So that's x minus 3 times x minus 3, or I can write it as x minus 3 squared. Now from here, we're going to be using the square root property to solve. So this goes back to one of the previous videos. To get rid of the squared, I need to take the square root of both sides, and I need to remember my plus or minus. So that's x minus 3 equals plus or minus square root of 5. Add 3 to both sides, and x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 5. Check the square root to see if it can be simplified. In this case, square root of 5 cannot be simplified, so I don't need to worry about that, and this is my answer. I can write 3 plus or minus square root of 5, or I could enter it as 3 plus square root of 5, comma, 3 minus square root of 5. So that's the answer for example 4. Make sure that you don't type x equals into the answer box because MyLab is going to mark that wrong. So next you should look at checkpoint problem number 4. Do this in your notes, check your answer, and then you can move on to the homework for this section.